Hello everyone, Alex here from warnoffkeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can create a mute command using Discord.js. Now, unlike the ban and the kick commands, which I've already covered, and a link to those will be in the video description, the mute command requires a lot more setup. The main reason for this is we can simply create a mute role that will disable people from talking in voice or connecting to voice channels and also talking in text channels, and then we can give a user that role. And that seems fairly simple, and it is. However, the problem comes up whenever you realize that Discord removes certain roles, actually removes all roles from a user whenever they leave the Discord. So with that said, if you were to mute a user and they were to leave the Discord and then rejoin, they are now unmuted because they lost all of their roles, and that also includes the muted role. We have to do some extra configuration to make sure that our bot remembers whenever a user joins if that user is still muted. Now, in the previous few videos, I've covered MongoDB, and that solves that problem. However, it doesn't solve the second problem we have, which is actually unmuting the user automatically once their mute expires. Not all mutes are going to be permanent mutes, and so sometimes you might want to mute a user for an hour or for a day or whatever duration you prefer. And so with that said, we need to use a software called Redis, which allows us to store information similar to a database, but we can also tell that information to only exist for a certain amount of time. So we can essentially say, mute this user for 20 minutes, and also let us know whenever that 20 minutes expires. Now, if you're familiar with the set timeout command within JavaScript, that allows us to run code later on. So we could technically solve that, but then another problem arises where what if our bot restarts due to an update or your server restarts for whatever reason? Then that user is actually never going to get unmuted and it becomes a permanent mute, and so that's not a solution that we should use. The Redis software solves all the problems we need solved within this solution, and even if you have no previous experience with Redis, don't worry, I'm going to show you how to very simply and easily set up a Redis server, and it'll be for free as well. So to get started, here I am inside my project. You can clone this project within the video description. There'll be a GitHub repository there, and I'm going to go in and make a new file. This will be called redis.js. If you've been following the series, we created a mongo.js file, which allows us to connect to Mongo easily. This will be similar, but for Redis. We need to go into our console and install Redis. We can do that with npm install Redis. And then inside of our Redis.js, I'm actually going to import Redis. So constant Redis equals require Redis. Now we're going to pause here and I'm going to go into my web browser. And if you sign up for an account on redislabs.com, this will allow you to create a free server. So your screen and my screen might be slightly different. It might prompt you to create a Redis server right whenever you're actually creating your account. However, I've already created a server and then deleted that server, so I see this screen. But I'm going to create my own Redis server using this plus sign, and you are going to want to select AWS, and then also select any free tier that you possibly see, and most of the other defaults should be defined to use. So for my exact use case, my database name is going to be tutorial. And I'm actually going to reveal the password here, and I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this as a comment right in this file. We'll use that later. I can then click on activate to create my server, and we see the spinner at the top right. It says pending. That means it's actually creating the Redis server for us. After a few seconds, I now see active, and we also see this endpoint right here. This is important to note. I'm actually going to copy this and paste it inside of our file as well. So Redis Labs allows us to host a free Redis server. However, we can't actually view some of the information that a Redis server provides. To do that, we have to use a different website called Redsman. And if you create another account here, at the top right, you will see Redis servers. And I'm going to connect a Redis server. It actually pops up right here. So the name of my server is going to be tutorial. And then the connection string is going to be auth at, and then our server endpoint. So in order to do that, we have to copy the password, paste it in, put an @ symbol, and then we want to copy our endpoint, which is the other thing we copy and pasted. We can then paste that afterwards and click on connect. So now we're actually connected to our Redis server. And we see some information here. A lot of this doesn't actually matter to us at the moment. We see this search box at the top left though. And this is actually allowing us to search through our Redis server. And if we put a star in there using Shift and 8, then you can actually search through every single thing that's stored on the Redis server. Now right here, it says no keys found for star. And that's actually expected because there's nothing actually stored on our Redis server yet. But this shows that we can actually connect and search through our Redis server, which is hosted on Redis Labs. So we're actually done with Redis Labs. We can go ahead and close this. We're going to be using Redsmin for the rest of this whenever we're actually dealing with our Redis server. But now we can try and connect to the server. So going back into Redis here, we can open our config.json file. And if you haven't been following along with the series, this contains our bot token so we can log in, our command prefix, and our Mongo path. We're now going to add another property called Redis path. And then we can go back into Redis and we can copy this endpoint here and paste it here. We want to start this with 2 forward slashes though. So your string should be / Redis and then the rest of your endpoints. Afterwards, we want to add a question mark. And the question mark within URLs essentially states this is where our parameters or our options are going to start. We can say password equals, and then we want to go back and copy our password and paste it right there. We can then save the file. And after closing it, we can actually get rid of this stuff right here. We then want to import the Redis path from our config.json file. And to do that, we can destructure the import. We can say Redis path equals require config.json. And now this file is going to actually export a function. So module.exports, and we are just going to have no arguments here. So this function is going to return a promise. So we have to return await new promise. We're going to pass in resolve and reject. Now, because we're using await here, this function has to be asynchronous. I'm going to create a variable called client and set this equal to redis.createClient. One parameter here will be an object, and inside we can say the URL will be Redis path. Now, similar to Discord servers, we can listen for certain events. So we can say client.on error, and this will be ran whenever there's an error. Maybe your password is incorrect or the server's down or something like that. We're then going to have a callback, which will just have the error object. And we can say console.error, Redis error. So we're going to let ourselves know in the console what went wrong. We're going to close the client. Similar to MongoDB, as I've mentioned in the last few videos, you want to close connections to the Redis server, and we do that with client.quit. And then we want to reject passing in our error. However, if it worked, we get the ready text. So client.on ready, and we are simply going to resolve passing in the client. So now this is everything we need within our Redis file. We can actually save and close this. And now we want to make a new file and call this mute.js. This is going to export a function, which will take in a client as a parameter. And then we need to import a couple files. So we can import Redis using require Redis. Keep in mind that we're importing the local file and not the actual dependency. This is why we have the / here. We also need to import the command file, which is a very basic command handler that I have. You'll find that in the GitHub repository. Now we need to create an actual command. So we're going to call command, passing in the client as our first argument, the actual command, which will be mute, and then a callback, which will give us a message object. So our goal is to have a syntax like !mute, the actual person, and then a duration, let's say like 10, and then a duration type, which will be M, H, or D. So M will be minutes, H will be hours, and D will be days. This might not be the most user-friendly command syntax. However, you can change that with your own implementation. I'm just trying to make sure that you guys understand how to actually implement the mute command here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the user is an administrator. You can actually check for whatever permission you want. However, to keep it simple, I'm just going to check for administrator. We can actually get the member who sent this by destructuring it from the message. And we can say if not member.has permission, and then we can pass in administrator. Now here we can actually complain to the user, but we need access to the channel, which also is a property of the message object. We can then say channel.send. You do not have permission to run this command. And then we can return. Now at this stage, we know that the user actually has administrator permissions and they're allowed to use this command. Now we need to actually gain access to the target that's mentioned, the duration, and the duration type. The easiest way to do this is to split the command on a space. So we can say const split equals content dot split with a space here. And to gain access to this, this is actually another property of message, and this will be the entire text. So if we have the command !mute, whatever the @ is, and then 10, and then h, this will mute the user for 10 hours. We would then have an array like this, with the first element being the command, the second element being the whatever the @ is, the third element being the duration, and the fourth element being the duration type. Now, one thing we want to be aware of is in case someone enters multiple spaces, we might want to use content.trim, which will remove extra spaces that we don't need. And so we're going to always ensure that we do not have any prefixed spaces or spaces at the end that might mess up with our code. So now the two main things we want from here is going to be the duration and the duration type. We can actually get the mentioned user a different way, and I'll cover that in a second. But the very first thing I want to do is make sure that split has a length of 4, because otherwise it does not have all the parameters we need. So we can say if split.length is not exactly equal to 4, we can then say channel.send. We can say, please use the correct command syntax. And I'm actually going to be creating a variable called syntax because we're going to be using this multiple times. So constant syntax equals @mute or !mute, and then the and then the duration as a number, and then the duration type, but we're going to say MHD or life. And so minutes, hours, days, or life, and life will be a permanent mute. And so now we can actually concatenate this, so plus syntax, and then we can return. So now we need to make sure that duration is an actual number, and we can store duration and duration type in their own variables. So constant duration equals split index2. So index 0 will be the command, index 1 will be the index 2 will be the duration, and index 3 will be duration type. So we can say constant duration type will be split index 3, and we can say if is NaN for not a number, we can pass in duration. We can then complain to the user. So channel.send, please provide a number for the duration. And then we can append the syntax here, and we can return. So if we enter A or low or something like that, we're actually going to complain to the user because those aren't numbers. Now the duration type has to be a very specific set of strings, MHD or life. Now we can check this just by checking to see if it equals some of those. However, there's a better way to do this, and we have to create an object here that is going to store the actual numerical value for each of those. So by default, the duration is going to be seconds. However, we need to then multiply it by certain values to get it equal to what the user expects. If that doesn't make sense, just keep watching. I'll explain better in a few seconds. So we're going to create an object called durations. We're going to say minutes will be 60. The reason for this is there is 60 seconds in a minute. And like I mentioned, duration by default is 1 minute long. So if duration is, let's say 10, we would then multiply it by minutes. So that's essentially multiplying it by 60. And that would give us how many seconds there are in 10 minutes. We can then say hours, which will be 60 times 60, days, which will be 60 times 60 times 24, and life, which will be -1. So now we need to see if the actual duration type is included in durations. So we can say if not durations index of duration type, we could then complain to the user. So channel.send, please provide a valid duration type. And then we can add in the syntax, and then we can return. And so now we have the actual values that we want, and it also doubles as the ability to check if the user syntax is correct. Next, we're going to create a constant called seconds. And like I mentioned, duration will be seconds by default. We then need to multiply it by one of these values to get the correct number of seconds. So constant seconds equals duration times durations, which is the object, index of duration type. So if this doesn't make sense, essentially, let's say we enter 10H, or actually 10M, because it's easier to understand, we can then say seconds equals 10 times M. And M is actually just 60, as we see right here. And so that's however many minutes. And if we do 10 times 60, this is actually how many seconds is inside of 10 minutes. And so our seconds then holds the correct value. Now, if we enter life, then that means this is going to be a negative number. And so we can simply check to see if our seconds is greater than 0 whenever we're actually trying to mute the user in Redis. The next step is to actually connect to our Redis server. So we can say constant Redis client equals await Redis. Now this is using await. So inside of this function, we have to make this asynchronous. And similar to Mongo, we're going to use a try finally. So inside the finally, we can say Redis client.quit. And this will actually close the connection to our Redis server. Now inside of here, we want to actually store in Redis that this user is actually muted. However, we don't have access to the user at the moment, So we need to gain access to it through the actual mentions. So if we go over to our destructuring, we can destructure mentions, and then we can console log that right here. So mentions, and then mentions. We can then save this and run our bot with node index.js. We see the client is ready. Going back to the Discord server, I can go into my testing channel, I can run !mute, and if nothing happens, that's because we're not actually importing our file. So we can create a constant called mute and import our file. And then we can actually run our file, passing in the client, which is the parameter we need right here. So after we save our index, we can actually close that. We don't need it anymore. And then we can restart our bot. Now going back into here, we can try muting. And it says, please use the correct command syntax. So if we just enter a couple different things, it's going to complain to us. And also if we say mute and then tag myself and then say hello, which should be a number, but it's not obviously, and then m, it'll then complain saying, please provide a number for the duration. And so it understands that. However, if I do !mute at Alexander Flores 10m, we then see a console log here because that actually worked. And so scrolling up, we see mentions and we see users. And so we can actually gain access to the first mention. So we can say const target equals mentions.first, and then we can console log the target. So if we save this and we restart our bot, we can then go in and run the same command. So I'm just going to copy this. We get an exception because we're supposed to do mentions.users.first. If we scroll up, we see the users property right here, and this returns a collection. That's where the first function actually lives. That's just a mistake on my part. We could then save our file and restart our bot, and then we can run the same command. And now we get this exact user with an ID, which is what we want, and all the other information. So what happens if I don't actually tag a user? Let's say we do !mute testing 10m. We then see undefined. So this is the actual first mention. And so what we can do here is say, if not target, which undefined would technically be falsy, we can then say channel.send, please tag a user to mute, and then we can return. So now we have all the information we want. We know that everything is working, and we want to then destructure the ID. So const ID equals target, and this will give us access to the user ID. And now we want to actually create a Redis key. So a Redis key is essentially a primary key similar to what we've been doing in Mongo that allows us to uniquely identify a certain object that is stored inside of Redis. So we can say constant Redis key, and this is going to be in as template literal using backticks. We can say muted dash and then the actual ID. Now we want to actually save this to Redis, and we can say Redis client.set Redis key, and then we can just say true, for example. So if we save this and we restart our bot, we can then go back and mute myself. So mute at Alexander Flores 10m, and it says it ran the command, so nothing actually happened here. But if we go back into Chrome and we refresh by simply just pressing enter when inside of the search field, we then see this object right here, muted, and then my user ID. If we click on this, we see the value is true. This is actually irrelevant. We don't technically need a value. But if we look at the right, we see TTL is none. Now TTL stands for time to live, and this is going to be how long it takes for this actual object to expire. So going back here, there's a certain way we can do this, but we want to make sure that we're not setting a TTL for a permanent mute. So we can say if seconds is greater than 0, then we're going to run the code that we just did, which does not have an expiration. Otherwise, we're going to run this and we're going to pass in 2 more arguments. The first one is capital EX. That'll tell Redis to make this expire. The second one is the actual value, and we're going to pass in seconds. This should always be in seconds, and that is why we call the variable seconds, so we actually have the calculation result in seconds. So we can save this, and I can restart. I can then run the command again, so mute at Alexander Flores 10m. We go over here and we refresh. We see the TTL is none. That's actually a problem. That's because we're saying if the seconds is greater than 0. So these two need to be swapped. So if there's something that is greater than 0, that means we did not enter to mute for life. And so this is a temporary mute. And so we want to set an expiration. However, if it is less than 0, that means it's a negative number. The reason for that is we're multiplying against -1. and that'll always result in a negative number. And so here we actually want to set a permanent mute. Now, one use case you might want to check for is making sure that the duration is a positive number. Otherwise, you could get some weird values here, but I'll leave that for you in your own application. Here, it's not relevant. We can save this and we can restart our bot. We could then run !mute and tag myself and then 10m. Going back into Redis, we can refresh. And right here under TTL, we see 10 minutes. And so now in 10 minutes, this will actually expire. So we're getting close to being done. There's only a couple more things we have to do. The first thing is we're going to actually create a muted role, and I'm going to make it so you cannot join or speak in voice channels with that role, and then you also cannot type in text channels with that role. So to do that, we can go into Warn-Off Keys, Server Settings, Roles, and I actually have a muted role already right here. If we scroll down, we see that Send Messages is disabled, and scrolling down further, Connect and Speak is disabled. So if someone has this role, they're actually not able to really talk anywhere. So now we can close this. And now we want to detect whenever someone actually joins the server and want to see if that user is actually muted. So we can do this above our command here. We can say client.on guild member add, and then we're going to get a callback, which will have a member object. Inside of here, we're going to destructure the ID, so constant ID equals member. And now we want to gain access to the actual Redis key. However, we don't want this ID right here, we just want this prefix. Now this might not seem like a very long thing to type multiple times, but we want it so if we ever change this, we don't have to go through and change it multiple places. So I can actually make this its own variable called Redis key prefix. And then if we go up to the top of the file, we can create a constant called Redis key prefix and set that equal to the actual prefix here. And now we want to actually see if this user is muted. So to do that, we have to create a new connection to Redis. So const Redis client equals await Redis. Because we're using await, this function has to be asynchronous. I can then use a try finally. I can say Redis client.quit. So after we're done with our Redis connection, we actually close it. Then here I can say Redis client.get. We're going to pass in a template literal here, and this will be the Redis key prefix and then the ID, which we're destructuring from member. And this is going to give us a callback, which will have error or result. So if there's an error, we can console.error. We can say Redis get error and then call it right there. Otherwise, we can actually have the results. Now we want to say else if result, and because this is going to be the string true, because that's what we're setting it to. We can see that if we go down to the bottom of the file, we see the value right here. So that's an actual string. Now going back up, if true is not there, therefore the actual object isn't there, then nothing's going to happen. We're going to go here and it's not going to actually do anything. However, if this else if statement is true, then that means that the user is actually muted. So we can actually gain access to the guild and then also gain access to the role from that and then apply that role to the user. So this is only going to occur whenever someone who was muted leaves the Discord and then rejoins. However, this will prevent people from actually leaving the Discord just to get unmuted, because that obviously defeats the entire purpose of having a command. So we can gain access to the guild from the member by destructuring it, because it is a property of the member object. And then we can get the actual role, so const role equals guild.roles.cache.find. And this is going to allow us to have a callback for every single element in the roles list. So we're going to have a role as the parameter, and we're going to return something if role.name is exactly equal to muted with a capital M, which is the exact name of my role. Now we can say if role, making sure that it actually exists. We can say member.roles.add role. And I actually want to take all of this functionality and convert it into its own function, because I want to create a simulate join command. I did this in a previous video, so if you've been following along, then you understand what's going on here. I'm going to create a function called onJoin. This will have a member object, and then everything inside of this code right here, inside this function, I'm going to move right up here. Now I can actually call this, so we can say onJoin, and then pass in the member. This no longer has to be asynchronous. However, this does have to be asynchronous because we're using await inside of it. Now I'm going to create a new command, passing in the client. This will be called simjoin, and we're going to have a message callback. I could then pass in message.member, which is the actual author of the message, into onJoin. So we can do that by simply calling onJoin and then passing in message.member. So now if I run !simjoin to simulate a join, it'll automatically have the same exact functionality as someone actually joining the Discord. This way I can actually test this without removing a bot and adding a bot and actually going through the manual process. So to make sure that we understand what's happening, we can add some console logs here. So console log muted, and then we want to append the ID. And then we can say else console.log could not find the muted role. And then right here as an else statement to this else if, we can add a console log saying the user is not muted. So now under any situation, we're going to have a console log so we have a better idea of what's happening. We can then save this and I can restart the bot. Going into Discord, I can run !simjoin to simulate a join. Okay, so we actually have a problem here. So cannot destructure property ID of member as it is undefined. And that's simply because I misspelled member. So if you spell it correctly and then you restart, we can go back and we can simulate a join again. And then we see muted and then the actual user ID. Now that's because this is still here inside of Redsman. You see it has a TTL of 3 minutes. However, we can actually delete it manually with the delete button right here and then clicking OK. If we refresh, we see that there's no keys anymore, so it was deleted. Going back into Discord, we can simulate another join, and we see the user is not muted. So this works here. Now, if we look at my actual member here, we have muted as a role. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to then mute the user, so mute @AlexanderFlores 10M. Now we see we don't actually have that role. So that's another feature we have to actually implement, which we can easily do just by getting the role and then applying it to the user. But if I simulate a join, and then I look at my member, we now have the muted role. So we can essentially go into our Visual Studio Code here, and then we can copy the code that will actually apply the user role, and we can add that to its own function. So const give role equals member. And then here, we're going to get the role from guild.roles, but we don't have access to this. So we can run member.guild. And now here we can just simply say give role and then pass in the member. And we don't need access to this guild variable anymore, so we can get rid of it. So now our functionality to give a role is inside of its own function. That way we can call it multiple times through multiple different places, which we're about to do. So scrolling down, whenever we mute the user, we have access to this target. And then here, after this last if statement, that way we actually make sure that everything is working, we can say give role and then pass in the target. If we save this, we can restart our bot. Going into Discord, we can make sure I do not have the muted role, and we can try muting myself. So mute @AlexanderFlores 10M. We get an exception, cannot read property roles of undefined. This is actually because this is technically not a member object. However, it does have some information. If we console log the target instead of give role, so console log target, you'll see what I mean. We can now restart our bot and we can run mute @AlexanderFlores 10M. We see if this is a user object. A user object and a member object are slightly different. The member object has a lot more information. And so we need to actually gain access to the member object. We can do that using the ID. And we can destructure that from the message object because guild is a property there. And scrolling back down, we can say guild.members.cache.get and pass in the ID. And here you can say const member equals this. And then we can say give role and pass in the member. We can then save this and restart our bot. Okay, so we have another problem where member has already been declared. So it's right here. So we can actually rename this to target member and paste that in right there. Now we can restart one more time, and then we can run mute @AlexanderFlores 10M. Okay, so this is giving us a different error. It says ID is not defined. Scrolling up, that's because we do not have access to the ID right here. So we can simply pass in member.id. We save this, we can then restart, and we can run mute @AlexanderFlores 10M. And then it says muted this ID right here. If we look at my user, I now have the muted role. So now it automatically gives me that role whenever we actually run the command. Now the reason why I can still type is because I have administrator permissions, and so I bypass that. However, normal users will not be able to type. So the final step is to listen for whenever the Redis object is going to actually expire based off of the TTL. Now the easiest solution is to use a set timeout. However, there is a problem with using set timeout, and that is if your bot restarts at all, that user will then be permanently muted because the set timeout is then lost. So we actually already have a Redis key set to expire. And so now we just have to listen for whenever that Redis key expires and then run the unmute functionality. Okay, so I typically don't like to do this within my tutorials. However, the exact nature of how this works is very much outside the scope of this entire series. And so I don't want to get too into the details of how Redis works when it comes to this type of stuff. However, essentially this code here, which you'll find in the video description, will let us know whenever something expires. And so you can copy and paste this into the bottom of your Redis file. And this is going to allow us to pass in a callback function that will be ran whenever something expires. So how we can use this, if we go back to our mute file, is we can say redis.expire, and we're going to get a callback, which will have a message. We can say if message.starts with Redis key prefix. We can then console log saying expires or expired, and then we're going to pass in the message. Now going back to the bottom of our file, I've actually changed the expiration of everything to 3 seconds, so we don't actually have to wait a minute or whatever it is. So with that said, if we save this and we run our bot with node index.js, we could then go into our server and we can try muting myself. Now keep in mind, I'll only be muted for 3 seconds, and you should see in the console that I get muted, and then in 3 seconds, it should actually say I'm unmuted, or that rather it expired, and we see that right here. Now with that said, we can actually split this string on a dash and then get access to the user ID. However, we then run into a problem, which is we don't know which guild this is associated with. So we can actually add in the guild ID onto the actual string right here. So we're just going to add a dash and then say guild.id. We have access to guild because we destructured it near the top of this function. And so now if we scroll all the way up, we then want to gain access to the guild ID here as well. And so we can destructure the guild, we can add a dash, and then guild.id. The reason for this, again, is within this expire, this is going to run for any server that your bot is in. And so we do not have direct access to know where exactly this user was muted. And so we add the guild ID. And so with that said, we can now say const split equals message.split and pass in a dash. We're then going to have an array with the text muted, and then the actual user ID, and then the guild ID. So we can gain access to the guild. So constant guild equals client.guilds.cache.get. We can pass in the guild ID. We have to actually make this. So constant guild ID equals split index 2. And then we need access to the user ID, which is split index 1. Now we have the guild. To make sure that this works, we can console log guild.name. We can save this. We can restart our bot. We can try muting myself. So mute at Alexander Flores 10M. We see we're muted. And then in 3 seconds, we see worn off keys right there, which is the name of the Discord. So now we have access to the guild. We could then get the member. So constant member equals guild.members.cache.get and pass in the user ID. Let's actually rename this. If you click on here and you press F2 within Visual Studio Code, you can say member ID and it renames it here as well. We can then say member.roles.remove role, but we need access to this role. And so going down here, we see that we get the role. And so because we're using this in multiple places, we can create a function called get role. And we need to pass in a guild here. We can then copy this, and we can now return guild.roles and return like that. Now constant role can equal get role. We can pass in member.guild. And now to get the role here, we can say const role equals get role and pass in our guild. So then we can remove it. Now I'm going to make the expiry time a little longer. So let's say 10 seconds. That way we can actually see that our role is being added and removed from muted. So I can get rid of it manually. And if we restart our bot, I can then go back. We see that I'm not muted. If I run mute, at Alexander Flores 10M. We then see muted, and we see I have the muted role right here. However, in 10 seconds, we'll see in the console, and then shortly after, we'll see on Discord that I get unmuted. So here we see that got removed. I actually removed the console logs in the console. So if we go to the top of our file, we don't see any of those, but it obviously ran because it got removed from my user right here. And so this should be a fully working mute system. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Worn Off Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.